The night my sister told the hospital receptionist she was an only child, I was standing 10 feet away holding the coat I bought her 23 years ago. I remember the smell of burnt coffee in the waiting room, and the way the vending machine buzzed louder than the television mounted in the corner. Outside, rain dragged itself down the windows in crooked lines, and everybody in that emergency room looked exhausted in the same quiet way. I had been sitting there for almost 6 hours with my purse on my lap, and my shoes soaked through, because I'd rushed out of the house too quickly to change them. My hands were wrapped around a paper cup that had gone cold an hour earlier, and when I heard my sister say those words, something inside me folded in on itself so softly I don't think anyone else could have heard it. "I don't have any siblings," she said. Not loudly, not cruelly, just casually, like it was easier that way. And the strange thing is, that wasn't even the moment that hurt the most. My name is Evelyn, and for most of my life, I believed love could survive almost anything if you were patient enough with it. I believed people came back to themselves eventually. I believed family remembered. Maybe that sounds naive now. Maybe it was. My sister Claire and I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Ohio where the walls rattled every winter when the pipes froze. We shared a mattress until I was 14 because Mama couldn't afford another bed. And every Sunday night we'd sit at the kitchen table eating tomato soup, made with extra water while Mama counted dollar bills under the yellow stove light. Claire was 3 years younger than me, all bright eyes and stubborn curls and impossible dreams. Even when we were little, she carried herself like somebody who already knew she belonged somewhere bigger than where we lived. I used to tease her about it while braiding her hair before school. "You walk around like you own Wall Street," I'd tell her. And she'd grin at me through the cracked bathroom mirror and say, "Maybe one day I will." Mama worked double shifts at a nursing home until arthritis bent her fingers sideways. By the time I was 16, I'd started cleaning motel rooms after school to help pay rent. Claire hated seeing me tired. I remember one night I fell asleep at the table with a pile of folded towels beside me. And when I woke up, she had draped her little cardigan over my shoulders because she thought I looked cold. That was my sister. That was the girl I knew. When Mama got sick for real, everything changed fast. Ovarian cancer. Stage 3. I still remember the doctor avoiding our eyes when he explained it. Claire was only 15 then. She sat frozen in the chair beside me, gripping my sleeve so tightly her nails left little crescent marks in my skin. After that, I stopped thinking about college. Somebody had to work. Somebody had to keep the lights on and drive Mama to appointments and make sure Claire graduated high school with some kind of chance at a better life. So I became practical. I worked mornings at a diner and evenings at a grocery store. I learned how to stretch pasta for 3 days and how to hide overdue bills in drawers so Mama wouldn't panic. Sometimes I'd hear Claire crying quietly at night, and I'd pretend not to notice because dignity matters when you're scared. The year Mama died, Claire got accepted into a business program in Chicago. She almost turned it down. "I can't leave you here alone," she whispered one night while we sat on the fire escape outside our apartment. The summer air smelled like rain and hot pavement, and somewhere below us, a couple was arguing in Spanish near the laundromat entrance. "You're going," I told her. "But how?" "I'll figure it out." And I did. I picked up another job cleaning offices downtown after midnight. I sold Mama's wedding ring even though it made me sick to do it. I lied to Claire about where the money came from because I wanted her to leave without guilt hanging around her neck. The morning she boarded the bus to Chicago, she cried into my shoulder, so hard I could feel her shaking. "I'm going to make this worth it," she promised me. I kissed the top of her head and smiled even though my chest felt hollow already. "I know you will." For a while, she called every night. She told me about her professors and the giant buildings downtown and the way Lake Michigan looked at sunset. I could hear hope blooming inside her voice. And honestly, hearing her happy made all those double shifts feel survivable. Then little things started changing. Calls became shorter, then less frequent, then mostly texts. She sounded different too. Sharper somehow. Faster. Like she was always halfway out the door while talking to me. One Thanksgiving, she brought a boyfriend home named Daniel who wore expensive watches and called our neighborhood authentic in a tone that made me uncomfortable. Claire laughed at all his jokes, even when they weren't funny. I noticed she kept apologizing for the apartment. "Sorry it's cramped," she said while setting plates on the table. "Sorry the wallpaper's peeling. Sorry the heat acts weird. Sorry about the smell from downstairs." Every apology landed like a tiny cut. After dinner, I found her standing in the kitchen staring at our old refrigerator covered in faded magnets and overdue coupons. You okay? I asked. She smiled too quickly. Yeah, just weird being back here. Back here. Not home. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. A few years later, she got a corporate job in New York. Then came the luxury apartment, the designer coats, the social media photos with rooftop cocktails, and polished people smiling under string lights. I was genuinely proud of her. I need people to understand that. I bragged about my sister constantly. At work, at church, at the grocery store. I told everybody she'd made it. Meanwhile, my life stayed small and steady. I became a receptionist at a dental office. I bought a modest little house with squeaky floors and a tiny porch where I kept potted herbs. I adopted an aging golden retriever named Murphy, whose hips gave out every winter. My life wasn't glamorous, but it felt honest. Claire visited less and less. Birthdays became rushed phone calls. Christmases became maybe next year. Sometimes weeks would pass before she answered my messages. When she did, she always sounded distracted. One evening I mailed her a care package after she mentioned working late nights. Homemade cookies, tea bags, wool socks, the kinds of things Mama used to send us comfort through. 3 weeks later, I saw the unopened box sitting in the background of one of her online photos. Still sealed. I stared at that picture far longer than I should have. But even then, I defended her. I told myself success changes schedules. Pressure changes people. Cities harden you. I told myself love was still there underneath all the distance. Then came the phone call that cracked something open inside me. It was nearly midnight when Claire called, crying so hard I barely recognized her voice. Evie, she whispered, using the childhood nickname she hadn't said in years. I need help. And despite everything, I grabbed my keys before she even finished speaking. Stay with me, because what happens next changed everything. The first time I walked into my sister's Manhattan apartment, I stood silently in the doorway, trying not to look overwhelmed. The floors gleamed like still water beneath my shoes. There were fresh white orchids arranged on a marble table near the entrance, and the entire place smelled faintly like expensive candles and lemon polish. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, all silver light and moving traffic far below. Everything looked soft, quiet, untouched. Claire hugged herself as she paced near the kitchen island, wearing cashmere lounge pants that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. I didn't know who else to call, she said. Her mascara was smudged beneath her eyes, and for a second, she looked like the younger sister I remembered. Vulnerable, tired, human. What happened? I asked gently. She pressed both hands against her forehead before answering. Daniel left. I blinked. Left where? He moved out. Her laugh cracked strangely. Apparently there's someone else. For a moment, the city noise outside disappeared entirely. I just stared at her while she tried to keep herself together. How long? I don't know. She swallowed hard. Months maybe. I crossed the kitchen slowly and wrapped my arms around her before she could fall apart completely. She collapsed against me instantly, shaking with quiet sobs that soaked into my sweater. And right then, none of the distance mattered to me anymore. Not the unanswered calls, not the forgotten birthdays, not the unopened care package. She was my sister. That was enough. I stayed in New York for 5 days. I slept on her couch even though she offered the guest room, because somehow it felt easier to be nearby if she woke up crying in the middle of the night. Every morning I made coffee while gray winter lights slid across the apartment windows, and every evening I listened while she unraveled pieces of herself she'd apparently been hiding for years. He said I've changed, she murmured one night. Had she? I almost asked. Instead I said, people say cruel things when relationships end. But privately, I noticed things I couldn't ignore. Claire barely spoke to anybody outside work anymore. Her phone buzzed constantly with emails. She checked stock updates during dinner. Even her sadness seemed rushed, squeezed between conference calls and meetings. One afternoon, we went to lunch at a little cafe near her office. I wore my nicest coat, though I immediately realized it looked painfully ordinary beside the polished women walking through Midtown in heels sharp enough to sound expensive against the sidewalk. The hostess greeted Claire warmly. Welcome back, Miss Bennett. Claire smiled politely without introducing me. Not at first. I stood awkwardly beside her while the hostess led us toward a table by the windows. 2 women near the bar waved at Claire. Oh my God, Claire, one of them said brightly. We missed you at Olivia's fundraiser. Claire laughed lightly. Work's been insane. Then one woman glanced toward me. And who's this? There was the smallest pause. So small most people wouldn't notice it. But I did. This is Evelyn, Claire said finally. She came to help me out for a few days. Just Evelyn. Not my sister. Not family. Nothing. The woman smiled politely at me before turning immediately back toward Claire's shoes. Her handbag. Her world. I looked down at the menu and pretended my chest hadn't tightened. Maybe it sounds petty. Maybe it was nothing. But relationships rarely break apart in giant dramatic moments. Usually they erode quietly, one omission at a time. That night, I lay awake on the couch listening to traffic hum beneath the windows while questions drifted through my mind like smoke. Was she embarrassed by me? Had she always been? The next morning, she rushed out early for work, kissing my cheek distractedly on the way out. Make yourself at home, she called. After she left, I cleaned her kitchen because that's what I do when I'm anxious. I wiped counters and folded blankets and watered the orchids. Around noon, her laptop lit up on the dining table with an incoming message preview. I wasn't trying to snoop. I need to say that honestly. But my eyes caught the words before I could look away. Your sister still staying there? Then another message appeared beneath it. I don't know how you came from that background. You hide it well. I froze. A minute later came Claire's reply. Trust me, I've spent years trying. My stomach dropped, so suddenly I had to grip the edge of the counter. For a long moment, the apartment felt completely silent except for the refrigerator humming softly behind me. I read the message 3 more times hoping maybe I'd misunderstood it somehow. But I hadn't. That evening, when Claire came home carrying takeout containers and apologizing for being late, I almost confronted her immediately. The words hovered right at the back of my throat. Instead, I watched her move around the kitchen in silk trousers while city lights flickered across the windows behind her. She looked exhausted, lonely too, and somehow that made it harder. So I stayed quiet. A week later, back home in Ohio, I tried convincing myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe she'd been joking. Maybe wealthy people talk differently. Maybe I was sensitive because our childhood still sat close to my heart while she needed distance from it to survive. But once doubt enters love, everything changes shape. I started noticing how rarely she asked about my life anymore. How quickly she redirected conversations back to herself. How she'd send photos of expensive vacations, but forget to ask how Murphy was recovering after surgery. Then came Mama's birthday. Every year since her death, Claire and I visited the cemetery together. Always, no matter what. That year she canceled an hour before her flight. Something came up at work, she said quickly. I sat alone beside Mama's grave that afternoon with cold wind whipping through the cemetery grass. I brushed leaves off the headstone while church bells rang somewhere in the distance. And for the first time in my life, I felt angry with my sister. Not furious, just tired, deeply tired. That night I called her. She sounded distracted again. You okay? She asked. I looked around my quiet kitchen at the grocery flowers I'd bought for Mama and suddenly realized Claire had forgotten what day it was. Completely forgotten. Something inside me went very still. You forgot Mama's birthday, I said softly. Silence. Then a long exhale. Oh God. Not grief. Not sadness. Just inconvenience. I've had a lot going on, Evie. I closed my eyes. I know. I said I was sorry. You didn't even remember. Another silence stretched between us, heavy and unfamiliar. Then she said something that stayed with me for months afterward. You act like I owe my whole life to the past. I gripped the phone tighter. Nobody said that. You don't understand what it took for me to get here. My voice came out quieter than I expected. I think I do, Claire. She sighed impatiently, and suddenly I heard it clearly for the first time. Not stress, not distraction, resentment. Toward me, toward where we came from, toward every reminder of the girl she used to be. When we hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after midnight listening to Murphy snore beside the radiator. The house creaked softly around me while rain tapped against the windows. And somewhere deep down, I realized I was mourning someone who was still alive. Stay with me, because what happens next changed everything. 3 months later, I learned my sister had gotten engaged from Instagram. I was standing in line at the pharmacy when her photo appeared on my phone. Claire smiling beneath strings of white lights on a rooftop terrace, one hand covering her mouth while a man in a navy suit held her waist. A diamond flashed against her finger bright enough to catch the camera from across the room. The caption read, "Forever starts now." That was it. No phone call. No warning. No conversation. I stared at the image while people shuffled around me holding cough medicine and prescriptions, and I honestly thought maybe she'd forgotten to tell me in the excitement. So I called. It went straight to voicemail. She texted an hour later. "Sorry, crazy night. Wanted to tell you personally." But she didn't. 2 weeks later, a cream-colored wedding invitation arrived in my mailbox addressed to Ms. Evelyn Harper. Formal. Cold. Like I was a distant relative. No handwritten note. No little message tucked inside. Nothing. I almost didn't go. But family habits are hard to break. The wedding took place at a vineyard in Napa Valley where the air smelled like roses and expensive wine. Everything looked breathtaking in the kind of polished way magazines love. White chairs lined a hill overlooking rows of vineyards glowing gold beneath the sunset. Servers floated through the crowd carrying champagne flutes while a string quartet played softly nearby. I felt out of place before I even stepped out of the taxi. My dress suddenly seemed too simple. My shoes too practical. I kept tugging nervously at my sleeves while wealthy strangers laughed around me. Then I saw Claire. She stood near the ceremony arch in satin and lace, radiant beneath the evening light. For one impossible second, emotion rushed through me so strongly I almost cried. Because underneath all the hurt, she was still the little girl I'd raised beside cracked apartment windows and shared bowls of soup with. I walked toward her slowly. When she saw me, her smile flickered. Not disappeared. Just changed. "Evie," she said, air kissing my cheek carefully so she wouldn't smudge her makeup. "You made it." Of course I made it. I wanted to say that. Instead I smiled softly. Wouldn't miss it. People kept interrupting us. Wedding planners, friends, photographers. At one point Claire introduced me to someone from Daniel's family. "This is Evelyn," she said again. "Just Evelyn." The woman tilted her head politely. "Old friend." And Claire hesitated, before saying something like that. I felt the blood drain from my face. Claire noticed. I know she did. But instead of correcting herself, she glanced toward the photographer and murmured, "I have to go." Then she walked away. I stood there alone among strangers while laughter floated around me under twinkling lights. Something broke quietly inside me that night. Not dramatically, not all at once, but permanently. During dinner, I sat near the edge of the reception tent listening to speeches about Claire's ambition and elegance and success. People described her as self-made. That phrase echoed through me strangely. Self-made. As if nobody had carried her through the years when she couldn't carry herself. As if Mama hadn't worked herself sick. As if I hadn't handed over every dream I had so she could keep hers. Halfway through dessert, I slipped outside for air. The vineyard stretched dark and quiet beneath the stars. Crickets hummed softly in the distance while music drifted from the reception tent behind me. I stood there breathing cold night air until I heard footsteps approach. Claire. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she crossed her arms tightly against the chill. "You disappeared." I looked out toward the vines. Needed some air. Silence settled between us. Finally I turned toward her. "Why do you keep pretending I'm not your sister?" Her expression changed instantly. Defensive. Tired. "That's not fair. Isn't it? You're making a scene." I laughed softly because there was nobody else around to witness one. "A scene," I repeated. She rubbed her forehead impatiently. "You don't understand these people." "No," I said quietly. "I think I finally do." Her jaw tightened. "They judge everything, Evie. Where you grew up, how you talk, what your family looks like. And I embarrass you." She didn't answer. That silence told me more than words ever could. When she finally spoke, her voice came out strained. "I worked hard to build this life. I know you did. You have no idea what it's like constantly trying to prove you belong somewhere." I stared at her for a long moment beneath the vineyard lights. "Claire, you belong somewhere before all this." Something flickered across her face then. Guilt maybe. Sadness. But it vanished quickly. "You always make me feel bad for wanting more." The words hit harder than I expected. Because they weren't true. I had wanted more for her long before she ever wanted it herself. "I gave up everything so you could have more," I whispered. She looked away immediately. And that was when I understood the real problem. It wasn't that she forgot. It was that remembering made her uncomfortable. A week after the wedding, we stopped speaking. Not officially. No dramatic ending. Just silence growing larger between us until neither of us crossed it anymore. Months passed, then almost a year, and one rainy Thursday night, my phone rang from an unknown number. It was a hospital in New York. Claire had collapsed during a charity event after experiencing severe abdominal pain. There were complications. Emergency surgery. No spouse available because Daniel was overseas. She listed you as emergency contact, the nurse explained gently. Of course she did. I drove through the night in heavy rain with both hands gripping the steering wheel while old memories kept surfacing one after another. Claire at 7 years old hiding behind me during thunderstorms. Claire falling asleep against my shoulder on city buses. Claire promising she'd make it worth it. When I arrived at the hospital, she looked smaller somehow. Fragile beneath pale fluorescent lights and stiff white blankets. Tubes curled around her arms while machines beeped softly nearby. For a long time, I just sat beside her bed holding her hand. Then she woke up. Her eyes found mine slowly, and something cracked open across her face the moment she realized I'd come. You came, she whispered. I almost laughed from the ache of it. Of course I came. Tears slid silently into her hairline as she turned her face toward the pillow. And for the first time in years, she looked ashamed. Stay with me, because what happens next changed everything. Recovery changed my sister more than success ever did. Maybe pain strips people down to whatever's most honest inside them. Maybe hospitals make pretending impossible. I don't know. I only know that during those long quiet days in New York, surrounded by antiseptic smells and dim hallway lights, Claire finally stopped performing. The surgery itself wasn't life-threatening in the end, but complications kept her hospitalized for nearly 2 weeks. Daniel sent flowers exactly once. Huge white lilies that smelled so strong they made Claire nauseous. After that, mostly silence. I stayed anyway. Every morning I helped her sit upright when the pain hit too sharply. I brushed knots from her hair while daytime television murmured quietly in the background. At night, when nurses lowered the lights, we talked more honestly than we had in years. Not perfectly, just honestly. One evening rain tapped softly against the hospital windows while Claire stared down at her hands. I used to rehearse conversations before networking events, she admitted suddenly. What kind of conversations? She gave a weak smile. Ones where nobody could hear where I came from. I sat quietly beside her bed. I changed everything, she continued. My clothes, my voice, the stories I told people. Her eyes filled slowly with tears. At some point I started treating my whole life like something embarrassing I had to escape. I swallowed hard but didn't interrupt. Then she whispered the thing I think she'd been carrying for years. Every time people met you, I got scared they'd see the parts of me I worked so hard to hide. The honesty hurt, but strangely, it also softened something inside me. Because for the first time, I understood her arrogance hadn't really come from confidence. It came from shame. I never wanted your life, Claire, I said quietly. She looked at me then. Really looked at me. I know that now. A few days later, Daniel finally arrived at the hospital wearing an expensive coat and impatience all over his face. He kissed Claire's forehead distractedly while checking emails on his phone. I watched her watch him. That was enough. People revealed themselves clearly during hard seasons. When the doctor explained Claire would need several months away from work to recover properly, Daniel sighed before he could stop himself. Actually sighed. And suddenly the room felt painfully small. After he left, Claire stared toward the doorway for a long time. I think he loved the version of me that never needed anything, she murmured. I adjusted her blanket gently. A lot of people do. 3 weeks later, she came home with me to Ohio. At first she treated my little house like a temporary inconvenience. She complained about the weak water pressure and the squeaky guest room mattress. But slowly, quietly, something shifted. Maybe healing requires stillness. Maybe exhaustion makes room for truth. In the mornings, she'd sit on the porch wrapped in my old cardigan drinking coffee, while Murphy rested his gray muzzle against her knee. She started helping me cook dinner. She laughed more softly than I remembered. Sometimes I'd catch her staring around the kitchen with this distant expression, like she was rediscovering something she thought was gone forever. One Sunday afternoon we drove to Mama's grave together. Wind moved gently through the cemetery trees while clouds drifted low overhead. Claire knelt beside the headstone without speaking for a long time. Then finally she cried. Not elegantly, not quietly, just real. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I stood beside her with my hands buried deep in my coat pockets while years of tension seemed to loosen inch by inch between us. You know what the worst part is? She said eventually. What? I spent so much time trying not to become where we came from, her voice broke. I forgot those were the people who loved me before I became anybody. I looked down at the flowers resting against Mama's grave and felt tears sting my own eyes. You were already somebody, I said softly. Months passed. Claire ended her marriage not long after returning to New York. There wasn't some dramatic explosion, just truth arriving too late for both of them to ignore. She stepped away from her corporate job the following spring and started consulting remotely instead. Smaller projects, less money, more breathing room. We never became perfectly close again overnight. Real hurt doesn't disappear that neatly. Some wounds leave quiet scars. But she started calling regularly. Really calling. She remembered birthdays, asked about my life, drove down unexpectedly one weekend just to help me repaint the porch because she knew my shoulder had been bothering me. Tiny things. Important things. One evening while we folded laundry together, she held up one of my faded sweaters and laughed softly. You still keep everything forever. I smiled. Some things matter. She grew quiet after that. Then she crossed the room and hugged me, so suddenly it caught me off guard. I don't know how to make up for all of it, she whispered against my shoulder. I held her carefully, the way I used to when thunderstorms scared her as a child. You don't erase it, I said honestly. You just do better. And she nodded against me like someone finally ready to try. Last winter, we hosted Christmas dinner together at my house. Nothing fancy, just roasted chicken, candles on the table, old music playing softly from the kitchen radio. Snow drifted outside while warmth fogged the windows. At one point, Claire stood washing dishes beside me when she suddenly smiled. What? She shook her head. I used to think success meant never looking back. I dried a plate slowly while she continued. But honestly, the loneliest years of my life were the years I spent pretending I didn't come from love. The room felt quiet except for water running softly in the sink. And for the first time in a very long while, being beside my sister didn't hurt. Not because the past disappeared, but because we finally stopped lying about it. Sometimes people lose themselves while chasing the life they think they're supposed to want. Sometimes pride convinces people that survival means cutting away every reminder of struggle. And sometimes the people who loved us quietly in the beginning are the same people waiting patiently when everything falls apart. I still think about that hospital waiting room sometimes, about hearing Claire tell someone she had no siblings. But I also remember what came afterward, the apology in her tears, the trembling honesty in her voice, the way she finally looked at me again like family instead of history. And maybe that's what forgiveness really is, not forgetting the wound, just deciding it doesn't get the final word. So let me ask you something. If someone you loved acted ashamed of where they came from, would you walk away forever, or would you wait and hope they found their way back to themselves? If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe so you never miss a story. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, you are never alone.